Welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. What follows is horror fiction read in tooth and claw, and not for the faint-hearted. Consider yourself warned.
PseudoPod, episode 736, December 18th, 2020. This week's story, Lifeblood by Lee Murray. Hello everyone, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. I'm Alistair, your host, and this week's story comes to us from Lee Murray. Lee is a multi-award-winning author-editor from New Zealand. Her work includes military thrillers, the Tane McKenna adventures, supernatural crime noir series The Path of Ra with Dan Raybarts, and debut collection Grotesque Monster Stories. Editor of award-winning titles Hellhole, At the Edge, and Baby Teeth, Lee's latest anthology, Black Cranes, Tales of Unquiet Women, edited with Genevieve Flynn, came out in September. We shared The Genetic Alchemist's Daughter from this phenomenal anthology last month. Your reader for this week is Heath Miller. Heath started his acting career as a child in television. His stage work has taken him all over his native Australia, from classrooms to botanical gardens to historic museums and local theatres. He can be found in recording studios, comedy clubs, television sets, convention centres, and YouTube. An actor, director, and master of ceremonies, Heath is a graduate of the Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts, and currently finds himself living on an island off the coast of Portland, Maine. Since moving to the USA, Heath has become an Earphones award-winning narrator, recording audiobooks for Highbridge, Dreamscape, Macmillan, Audible, Penguin Random House, or as they will shortly be, Schuster, Penguin Random House, and Schuster, I suspect, as well as short stories on fiction podcasts, including Uncanny Magazine, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Podcastle, Pseudopod, and Far-Fetched Fables. That's a hell of a pedigree. And backing us up as ever this month on audio production duties is the incomparable Marty Perrette, with myself as your host. And so, without further ado, we have a story for you, and in ways which may surprise you, but I suspect may not. This one is true.
Lifeblood by Lee Murray. Read by Heath Miller. Nikola Silic drove his gum spear into the ground and let it stand upright while he bent to lift the clod from the ditch. Crouched in the trench, he weighed the blackened lump in his hand, then rubbed at it with his thumbnail. What would he find beneath the grunge? Would there be a droplet of the Kouri's lifeblood? A golden bead of tree sap, petrified for years and years beneath the soil, and turned as dark and rich as good wine. His heart skipped, and he breathed deep, his nostrils filling with the smoke of burning manuka bushes. In his head, he whispered, "Please, let it be good." The size wasn't bad. Not massive. Nikola had heard tell of a slab of gum the size of 3 well-fed men. But it was big enough to cover Nikola's palm. Shaped like a half-moon, it was encrusted with debris. It would need lots of scratching and scraping by the fire to free it of its rind before Perkins, the storekeeper, would condescend to swap it for supplies. Taking out his penknife, Nikola gouged the surface of the nugget, cutting away a patch for a better look. Underneath the grime, the resin was golden and pure. Nikola smiled. These Northland swamps were full of Kouri amber, and all you had to do was dig it up. British and Americans couldn't get enough of it for polishing their fancy carriages, although they needed deep purses, because the copal was fetching a colossal 43 pounds per ton. He chuckled. It certainly beat being back home in Volgograd, where the grapes were rotting on the vines. His stomach growled. Where was Perkins? Still no sign of the storekeeper's wagon. No matter. Nikola's day was made. Even after paying the week's bills, there'd be enough to buy him a good bit of lamb. He'd get himself some tea. Soap, too. A few more nuggets like this one, and he'd have enough to send home for a bride. Furtively, Nikola glanced about him. The Chinaman was digging for gum just 20 yards off, his head bent to the task. He wasn't looking Nikola's way. Good. Working quickly, Nicola knocked the biggest clumps of dirt off his prize, slipping the nugget into the picot sack slung over his shoulder before he straightened. The gum fields were full of scum, runaway militiamen and drifters, but there was something especially unnerving about that Chinaman with his slanted eyes and wide smile. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, a dark, scurrying thing, like a roach. Nicola didn't trust him. "Look out," said his friend and compatriot, George Unkovic, from an adjacent trench. "Here comes trouble." Nicola looked up. A couple of the local constabulary were making their way across the scrublands. The pair skirted the patches of Manuka burn-off, walking with the swagger of men accustomed to getting their own way. Word about the settlement said the younger one was decent enough, but his senior, a fat, balding man named Carter, was a mean-ass son of a bitch. George slapped the dust from his trousers. "Now, what do you reckon they'll be wanting?" "Dunno. Guess we're about to find out." Whatever it wasn't good news. Nicola had never seen them carry arms before. He freed his spear and climbed out of the trench. "You there, dullies," the constable said. "You need to clear off." Nicola started. "What? Why?" he sputtered. "We're not bothering anyone?" Carter sniffed. "That's the Cory Gum Industry Act, lad. Came into force yesterday, didn't it? So if you want to work here, you're going to need to get yourself a license." "What's this about a license?" asked Miloš Vasil, joining them from another ditch. "We've never needed one before." "You gotta see Perkins at the store," the young constable said. "He'll give you a paper to sign, and then you pay a quid, and Bob's your uncle." "Bob's your uncle," George echoed. Except it wasn't that simple. A pound was a lot of money, even for a gum digger, and Nicola still had bills to square. Squinting, he looked across the swamp at the men still at work. "You kicking everyone off, or just us Dalmatians?" The younger man lowered his eyes. "We're telling everyone," he mumbled. "What about the Chinaman?" "We'll be getting to him," Carter said. "I don't see the Brits leaving," Nicola replied. Carter raised the ancient musket and pointed it at Nicola. "You giving me trouble, Austrian?" "No trouble here," George said quickly. He clasped Nicola's shoulder, holding him back. "A pound, though," George said, sucking air through his teeth. "You have to admit that's a lot of money." The constable shrugged. "Not my problem, is it? I don't make the laws, sonny, I just enforce them. Anyway, you should count yourself lucky." He jerked his head toward the Chinaman. "The government makes their lot pay 100 quid before they're even allowed off the boat. Prime Minister Seddon wouldn't let them bring their wives with them either. Good thing, too, or the country would be overrun with the yellow devils." Gripping his spear, Nicola stepped towards the trench. "We'll see Perkins for your licenses later." Carter fired the musket at the sky. The roar split the air, making Nicola's ears ache. All around them, men looked up from their work. "If you want to dig gum, you'll see Perkins now," Carter said, when the smell and the noise had died away. His voice was calm, but the menace remained. "You want us to go right now?" George asked. His jaw twitched. Carter tilted his head to one side. "That's like I said. The law's the law, isn't it?" It was close to an hour's walk into town. They'd never make it back before the sun went down. Seemed they were done for the day. While Miloš went off to spread the word, Nicola and George collected up their belongings. They didn't have much, a spear and spade each, and the piku sacks they carried on their shoulders. The constable and his man hovered near the ditch. When Nicola and George were about to leave, Carter stepped out in front of them. "Leave the bags, dullies." Nicola made to move around him. "No. We've little enough. What's in here is mine." But the fat constable shifted his finger on the trigger. "What's in there is stolen goods. You dug up that gum without a license." "It's only one day's takings," George complained. Carter thrust the barrel at George's stomach. "Yes, be ashamed to die for a day's takings." His nostrils flaring, George gave in, scattering his gum on the ground. "There, you can have it, but I'm keeping the bloody bag." "Now yours," Carter said, swinging the musket towards Nicola. Nicola frowned. "Take it from him, Jones," Carter said, jerking his head. "Yes, sir." Lifting the sack off Nicola's shoulder, Jones took out the moon-shaped nugget and gave a low whistle. "Nice." "Right, now clear off," Carter said. "Don't come back without a license." Perkins' store was still open. Squeezing inside, Nicola and George filled out the form. It was hard to know what they were signing. Nicola's English was better than George's, and, even so, he only knew half the words. They waited in line behind the men, some of them waiting on licenses, others ordering spades, salt, bacon, even a new pair of boots. By the time they reached the front, the afternoon sun was burning orange-gold streaks across the planked floors. Nicola slid his paper across the counter of rough-cut Kori, polished with wear. Perkins flicked his eyes over the words. "That'll be a quid," he said. "I haven't got it," Nicola replied. "Gum?" "No," Nicola said, thinking of the moon-shaped nugget. "I'll owe you the money." Perkins pushed the paper back. "Can't help you. Sorry." Nicola shook his head, incredulous. "Why not? I'll pay the normal interest, same as I always do." "Not anymore. You dallies are too much of a risk." George elbowed his way forward. "What risk? We work as hard as anyone," he said. Perkins scratched at his nose. "Makes no difference if the plots have already been worked over. Naturalised New Zealanders, the Brits and the Maori, they get the new plots, those who can afford the paperwork. Dallies and Chinamen get what's left. I reckon there won't be much left to find, and if you don't find any gum, I don't get paid." Nicola shivered. The British were forcing them out. "Hey, if you're not trading, move out," someone shouted from behind. Nicola thrust the paper at the storekeeper. "Help us, then," he pleaded. "Give us a good plot." Perkins waved to the next man in the line, gesturing him forward. "It's not up to me," he said to Nicola. "If you don't like it, take it up with the government." "You know us," Nicola insisted. "We always pay." But Perkins was done with them, already talking to the next man. They made the long walk back to the camp, following the ever-present mists of burning Manuka. Their tent was just one of 100 or more makeshift dwellings, clustered on the edge of the gum fields, most nothing more than huts and bivouacs made from branches and bracken. The mood in the settlement was grim. True to their word, Carter and Jones had chased everyone off the field, even the Brits. One man had already acquired the precious license. A group crowded about him, demanding to see it. "What's it say?" one asked. "Read it out," said another. The man who owned it couldn't read, so Miloš Vasil did the honours, but nobody could glean anything new from it, so the men ambled away, off to their fires to drink, scrape gum, and tell stories. The Chinaman was sitting beside his campfire, his head bent, scraping gum. Nicola's breath caught. Wait, he'd seen that moon-shaped nugget before. "Hey, where did you get that?" He strode across the campground and snatched it out of the Chinaman's hands. The Chinaman jumped to his feet. Not mine, he said, dropping the knife and reaching for the nugget. Did you steal it? Nicola roared. No, I no steal. I scrape for policeman. This is my nugget. The Chinaman bowed. No, police nugget. Police give to me. I clean for them, he said. Leave it, George said in Nicola's ear. It's not his fault. Here, let's just get some food, eh? It's my nugget. He stole it, Nicola said. But there was no conviction in it. George was right. It wasn't the Chinaman's fault. You couldn't blame a cockroach for scuttling. Nicola released the gun, forcing the Chinaman to scrabble on the ground for it. When he stood up, he gave Nicola a sour, slanty-eyed look, then returned to his spot by the fire. There's plenty of gum still in the ground, George said, putting a heavy arm around Nicola's shoulders. I've got some stashed away. I'll trade it for the license, then I'll work the plot they give us, and you can scrape any gum I find, just until we get back on our feet. It was a decent offer, and a kind one, yet Nicola couldn't help glowering as his friend led him away. Nicola waited in line, his hat pulled forward on his head, and wiped a rag over the nugget's surface. Even in the gloom of the store, the Colonel gleamed like a new sovereign. This piece had been the last in the basket, their last income, until George carried more gum home from the gum fields. Nicola prayed his friend had better luck today. Nicola stepped forward, handing the nugget over the counter. Perkins lifted it to the light, and his eyes widened. I'll give you a loaf of bread and a knuckle of lamb for it. What? It's worth 3 times that, Nicola said. That's my price. It's robbery, that's what it is. The storekeeper gave him a wolf's smile. He held out the gum. Take your nugget, then. You can always walk to the docks, see if you can get a better price there. Nicola kept his hands in his pockets. There's no meat on that knuckle, he protested. Perkins shrugged. The bastard. The dock was a half-day's walk, and Perkins knew starving men don't haggle. In the month since licenses were introduced, the storekeeper had grown fat on the gum digger's misery. Nicola imagined him soaking his bread in bacon dripping, grease sliding down his chin. Nicola's stomach churned, the juice souring in his belly. It didn't do to think about food, not when you hadn't eaten since yesterday. Glaring at Perkins, he grabbed the bread and stepped outside into the scorching sun. The loaf was stale, but Nicola put his nose to the crust anyway and sniffed deep. It smelled heavenly. Saliva pooled under his tongue, and he almost fainted with longing. Instead, he tucked the loaf into his piku sack out of sight. He mustn't eat it. He had to save it for George. You couldn't dig gum on an empty stomach, and the gum was their lifeblood. Grasping a handful of gum leavings from his pocket, he rolled them in his palm, then stuffed the clod in his mouth, chewing on the salty resin to stave off his hunger on the hot walk back to the settlement. When he arrived, Carter and Jones were there again, stopping by to hand more confiscated gum to the Chinaman and to take away their newly polished nuggets. The Chinaman held something up, displaying his handiwork. Nicola's blood boiled. Why would they trust their gum to the Chinaman? The cockroach was eating better than he was. Nicola hovered in the alley. I could scrape that gum for you, he said, when Carter and Jones passed by. His stomach burned with shame. I'm a hard worker. Carter just laughed. Sure, he said. I'll keep you in mind. The pair sauntered away. The sun had set when George returned from the gum fields. He was too tired to wash. Slick with sweat and grime, he gobbled up the dense bread, washing it down with big mouthfuls of lamb broth. When he'd finished, he wiped his chin with his hand. You're not eating? I already ate, Nicola lied. You don't get hungry scraping gum. How did you do today? George dropped his eyes and waved a hand towards his pico. Nothing much, just some peas. Nicola opened the sacking bag, and his heart sank. Even polished into diamonds, the tiny grains weren't big enough to buy even half a loaf. He'd have to wait another day before going to the store. Fear seized him. What if the same thing happened tomorrow? What if the plot was empty, and George was turning the earth over and over for nothing? No matter, Nicola said brightly. You'll do better tomorrow. He could have saved his breath, because George was already asleep. Nicola licked out the pan, slurping up the dregs of broth, but the emptiness clawed at his guts. He lay awake for long hours in the darkness. With so little gum to scrape, and none to sell, Nicola had no choice but to follow the Maori woman into the forest to forage for food. He wasn't the only one. Several of his compatriots had joined the group, and he caught sight of the Chinaman through the trees. So, scraping Carter's confiscated gum wasn't enough for him. One of the Maori women snipped a spiral fern frond off its stem with her fingertips and put it into her flax basket. Good. The plant was edible. Nicola didn't wait. He broke off 3 fronds and ate them raw. While he was eating, the woman cracked open a rotting log and lifted out a fat, white grub. She dangled it in his face. Nicola shook his head. Grinning, the woman bit the creature's head off, chewing it even as it wriggled. She handed him the remainder of the grub. Nicola swallowed black bile and stepped away. You get hungry enough, these grubs are pretty tasty, Miloš Vasil said, taking the morsel from the woman and putting it in his own mouth. Nicola barely recognized the man. As thin as a spade handle, Miloš had tied a strip of flax around his waist to keep his trousers up. The Maori woman had gathered up the last of the larvae and was hurrying after the other womenfolk. There's a river about a mile in, Miloš said. They'll be going to check their eel traps. Together they followed the women deeper into the trees, stray branches brushing at their thighs. George is still working the plot, then? Miloš asked after a while. Nicola nodded. Any luck? Nicola sniffed. Some of us are heading to the port tomorrow, Miloš said. You can join us if you like. You're looking for work there? Miloš exhaled, a long breath. We're going home. There's nothing for us here now. How will you pay? We'll work our passage. Nicola's heart thumped. Could he leave George and return to Vorgorats? The vines had failed. He might be going home to starve. George might find something today, he said, finally. Sure, said Miloš. They passed under a grove of thick-trunked kauri, their feet sinking in the swampy ground. Nicola looked up. The trees were as tall as a ship's mast, their branches as wide as they were tall. Look at that, Nicola breathed. Up high, out of reach of the stippled trunk, was a boulder of golden resin as big as Nicola's torso, the result of an old injury, perhaps a branch broken off in a storm or by a bolt of lightning. If only he could reach it. A clump that size would fetch him an entire side of beef at Perkins' store. Nicola sucked in a breath, and it was as if the scent of the gum had cleared his head. These were kauri trees. They were full of gum. All you had to do was score them, and the trees would bleed. Why waste time digging when you could cut the trees and take what you wanted? Running to the nearest trunk, Nicola pulled out his blade. Miloš snatched at his sleeve. Don't. Puzzled, Nicola shook him off. Why not? Because the kauri trees are protected. If Carter catches you bleeding one, he'll lock you up. Look at us, Miloš, Nicola said, breathless with excitement. We're starving. You can hardly hold your pants up, so we take a little gum. Who's going to know? It's not just the police. The Maori say bad things happen if you hurt the trees. The gods get angry. Nicola rolled his eyes. That's just talk. Anyway, they dig for gum like everyone else. Milosh plucked at the fern and nibbled on the tip. It's not the same. How is it not the same? Milosh peered through the bush at the departing women. The Kauri in the swamp are dead. These trees are alive. Nicola stared at him. They say the gods punish you. Milosh whispered. Years ago, there was a bleeder who lived in the settlement. He did all right for a while before the gods came for him. Then he disappeared. Maybe he decided to go home. Milosh shook his head. He was cursed. Climbed up a tree to get a nugget like the one above us, but the gods stole his rope, and he got stuck there. Loggers found his skeleton when they felled the tree. Nicholas scoffed. Lack of decent food was affecting the man's brain. You don't really believe that. It's just a story. Milosh spat out a green husk. It's their country, isn't it? Their gods. What if we make a little cut, a tiny scratch just big enough to make the sap flow, but not enough to hurt the tree? There's a bounty, Milosh said absently. Nicola felt his eyes narrow. Would Milosh report him for the money? The man was little more than a skeleton, with big, gaunt eyes and hollowed-out cheeks. Hungry men did desperate things. Why risk it? Milosh would be gone tomorrow. Nicola gave his compatriot a solemn nod. You're right. It's their country. No need to upset the gods, is there? He put a hand on Milosh's back and steered him away from the massive trunks. Let's get after those women and see if we can score ourselves a fish head, shall we? On the way back from the river, Nicola stole away from the group. He selected a kauri, well back from the others, and chose a spot down low, hidden by a clump of fern. He didn't believe Milosh's superstitious prattle, but he wasn't about to get caught either. He'd make a little nick and squeeze out just enough gum to get himself a good meal and a license. Who would know? Checking there was no one about, he took out his knife and set it against the wood. Blunted by a month of scraping gum, the knife slipped on the bark, gouging a chunk out of the tree and slicing deep into his palm. Nicola sucked air in over his teeth. Dark red blood welled in the gash, and sap melted into the wound, the mixture turning red gold. Biting back the pain, Nicola pressed his bloody palm to his trousers to staunch the flow. Already, the nick in the tree was beaded with golden sap. Despite the throbbing in his palm, Nicola felt a surge of hope. At this rate, the kauri would deliver him a nugget the size of a coconut in just a few days. Let's see Perkins try and give him a loaf of stale bread then. 2 men carried George back from the gum field. He was burning up with fever. Sweat pooled beneath his arms and on his brow, yet he shivered beneath the thin blanket. Nicola lifted his head and fed him a sticky broth of fish and fern roots, but either the food was too strange or his friend was too sick, because George vomited it up again. Milosh's voice buzzed in Nicola's ears. The gods will punish you. The gods will punish you. Nicola ignored him. Bleeding the kauri had nothing to do with George's illness. It was a coincidence, nothing more. That night, as he slept on the ground beside his friend, Nicola had a nightmare. A tattooed warrior stole up behind him and sliced his throat with his greenstone club. Only in the dream, blood didn't gush from the wound. Instead, it beaded in the gash, dribbling slowly down his neck in a red-gold thread. He awoke to George's moaning. In the morning, George was no better, so Nicola became a gum digger again, leaving George in his bed while he went to work the plot. The land was a sorry sight, the earth pitted with holes, evidence of a month of fruitless searching. Nicola's palm throbbed where he'd sliced it, and his head buzzed with the heat. But he stabbed his gum spear into the ground and felt for the telltale tug of the resin beneath the blade. There was nothing. He was too weak to bury the blade in the dirt, the spear merely sliding across the surface. He lifted the shaft and stabbed again, his head swimming. All he needed was a decent nugget he could sell for real food, so George would get better. Then Nicola would harvest the resin trickling from the tree, and everything would be fine again. The spear slipped, just missing his foot. Nicola giggled. A blurry figure appeared on the horizon. Nicola's pulse thrummed. The warrior? No, it was the policeman, Carter. He was there in an instant. "What are you doing here, Sullock? This isn't your claim." Nicola looked up, squinting against a blaze of pink light. "It's George's claim. He's sick, so I'm working it for him." "That's what you say. How do I know you're not stealing it from him?" Nicola's throat tightened, the pink fading. "George is my friend. You can ask him." Carter raised the gun. "I could, but it's easier to make you leave. Tell you what, I'll let you keep your sack this time, since there's obviously nothing in it." He grinned. Nicola didn't have the energy to fight him. He could barely lift his spear. He shuffled off, trailing the blade in the dirt. Someone followed him home. Carter, maybe. Or the other one. Nicola was sure he could hear bare feet slapping behind him on the hard-packed dirt. "Who's there?" he said, stopping to look back. His heart leapt, and he tightened his grip on the spear. The wound in his palm throbbed, red gold blood oozing down the shaft, making it slick. It was the warrior from his dreams. Covered in fearsome tattoos, the man was crouched in the road, the muscles in his thighs rippling. The warrior screamed and brandished his greenstone club at Nicola, his tongue lolling out the side of his mouth. "What do you want?" Nicola shouted. But the warrior was gone in the hazy drift of Manuka smoke. Beside the track, the brush stiffened and rattled in the wind. "The gods will punish you," Milosh whispered. Except Milosh and the others had left for the port this morning. Nicola turned and spied the Chinaman through the smoky mist. Had it been him following Nicola all along? What did he want? And why was he slipping into the forest? Nicola shuddered. His skin prickled. Did the Chinaman know about Nicola's Kori? Of course he did. The Chinaman was everywhere. He was planning to steal Nicola's treasure. He'd stolen the big moon-shaped nugget. Nicola had seen him with it, whittling away at it in the firelight. Well, he won't be stealing from Nicola again. The pain in his hand flaring, Nicola pushed through the prickly manuka. The Chinaman was tricky. He pretended he was searching for food, stopping here and there to pinch off the spiral fern tips. Sometimes he'd pause to watch the birds flit about in the trees. Nicola wasn't fooled. He was heading for the grove of Kori, to the tree Nicola was bleeding. Nicola frowned. That gum was for him and George. By the time Nicola returned, the nugget would be enormous. Nicola would sell it to Perkins at the store. He'd get 2 licenses. 3. Good plots, too. Not barren bits of dirt that had already been picked over by the British. He and George would employ their countrymen to work the land. Maybe they'd get Milosh to be their foreman. Why not? They'd be pulling so much gum out of the ground they'd be able to send home for wives for everyone. The spear hadn't pierced the ground of the gum fields, but it made easy work of the Chinaman's thigh, the blade slicing through the artery at the top of the man's leg. Nicola pushed the blade home, slicing lengthwise. Blood sprayed from the gash. So much blood. Pink haze flooded Nicola's vision, the spurt of liquid mesmerizing him. The Chinaman slumped, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. His fingers flailed, searching for the edges of the wound. It was too late. The gush was already slowing, the thick clots of blood seeping into the ground. Nearby, the leaves rustled. Nicola looked up. Crouched low in the bracken, the warrior was watching him. He grinned at Nicola, but he made no move to stop him. Grinning back, Nicola rifled through the dead man's pockets and found the moon-shaped piece of gum. He held it up to the light. The Chinaman had whittled it into a fantail. Nicola burst into the tent. "George, see what I found. My nugget, only now it's a bird. Just look at the size of it." He stopped still. There were 3 men in the tent: Carter, Jones, and George. Of the 3 of them, only George didn't look at him, staring instead at the roof with dull, blank eyes. "Your friend's dead," Jones said, "and people said the younger one was decent." Nicola's lip trembled. His hand opened, and the bird tumbled to the ground. It was only then that he saw his clothes were covered in blood. "Jesus wept," Jones said. "That's the bird ye was carving for me," Carter said. "Grab him, Jones." Nicola turned on his heel and ran. One thing about being thin, it makes a man nimble. He flew through the forest, easily outstripping the constable, but not the warrior, who was following him again. No matter. Nicola didn't plan to stick around long. Just as soon as he'd harvested his gum, he'd go to the port and buy himself a passage home. Maybe even catch up with Milosh. He found the grove of Kori and the tree, circling to the spot where he'd scored the bark. He sucked in a breath. The drizzle of sap had grown to the size of a man's heart, the nugget hanging off the trunk like a perfect drop of honey. All he had to do was cleave it off. Nicola kneeled on the swampy ground. He took out his knife and sliced at the edge of the nugget, each stroke loosening the amber, but also causing him to sink a little more. By the time he'd prized the nugget free, Nicola was chest deep in the earth. He tossed the nugget up on higher ground and put his hands on the edge to pull himself out. The side of the hole broke away. He tried again. The edge crumbled. He was dizzy with exhaustion. He didn't have the strength to haul himself out. His body quivered with terror. He would drown here, petrified in the swamp like an ancient piece of gum. Unless... He twisted to look at the warrior watching from the bank. "Help me," he gasped. Grinning, the warrior stood up and extended his club, beckoning to Nicola to grasp its flattened end. Relief flooding him, Nicola lunged for it. But instead of pulling him out, the warrior swung the club and slashed it across Nicola's throat. Nicola's eyes widened as his lifeblood welled in the gash. "I told you the gods would punish you," Milosh said again. The warrior god stepped forward, placed his foot on Nicola's shoulder, and pushed him beneath the swampy ground.
Lifeblood was first published in Grimdark magazine, edited by Adrian Collins. This is from the afterword. Lifeblood, with its mean-spirited prejudice towards immigrants, pits one marginalized group against another in a grimdark tale of poverty and desperation. Information about the 1898 Kauri Gum Industry Act and the government's monstrous persecution of immigrant and native labour can be accessed on New Zealand's National Archives. When I tell people horror is a broad church, as I often do, stories like this are exactly what I'm thinking of. The genre's reputation, even in these post-Jordan Peele, pre-Dave Franco days of elevated horror, remains one intimately connected to exploitation and schlock in many places, and I'm honestly starting to think that's actually part of the plan, because when people don't see stories like this coming, they hit all the harder. This is a story pulled from and built on the truth, and setting it in the spotlight places its ugly historical realities in a different, far more in-depth concept. This is not the blunted obscenity of historical atrocity. This is that atrocity presented clearly and honestly and contemporaneously. and demanding we watch. An atrocity shorn of the reassurances of a distance, and instead presented under the unflinching lens of these scalpel-like words. Stories like this remind us the world we exist in is topped by a very narrow band of civilization. They dare us to not look away, and we should listen to them. And to go into more detail, here's Josh and Shauna's reviews of the author's collection.
Hi, I'm Josh Tuttle, Associate Editor here at PseudoPod. This is my review of Places We Fear to Tread, edited by John Braille and Joe Sullivan. My college fiction writing professor always used to tell us that a story is about characters rather than events. I always hated that advice. I'm more of a story of incident type of guy myself. My professor never talked about how to build a place. Setting, presumably, was merely a backdrop for the characters to be characterized in. The stories in Places We Fear to Tread aren't like that, thank God. These stories have characters in them, sure, but they're stories about the interaction between character and place, and oftentimes the places are characters. And oh boy, is there incident. There are a variety of places here, not just the where. Small towns, farms, buildings, bridges, lakes, parks, beaches, but different kinds of places. Places of desolation, desperation, and longing. Places of vengeance, places that trap you, places for doing things in. Some of the places contain things that do things, and in others, the places themselves do the doing. This is a book I waited 30 years for without knowing. I'll tell you about some of my favorites. I hope you like them too. The anthology opens with The Storm on Kinzua Bridge, a poem about two ghosts, one of a bridge, the other of the storm that killed it. On the theme of places and leaving them, Lost Girls Don't Cry shows us that rescuing ghosts against their will isn't doing them any favors. The Wrong Turn and The Sand Knows each have a place you can't leave once you enter, especially if you accidentally took what's not yours or gave up more than you meant to. Here in This Place is a Means to an End and The Dear God contain places where you can only succeed at something in a specific location, but you probably shouldn't do those things anywhere. The Sad Museum is about a house both quiet and threatening. It's unclear whether the isolation and vertical space in the floor plan are metaphors for the lives of the occupants or the causes of their discontent. Bare Bones is pure British folk horror, and The Hound of Bracketville is an American monster story about breaking down at the wrong time in the open, lonely desert. One badly hit ball takes place on some forbidden dunes near a golf course. You won't guess what their danger is, but those signs definitely are there for your protection. Bustle's Bog is about a lost town and its legend, and about some boys who track it down by accident. But my very favorite was The Bone Man of Sanatorium Lake. It unfolds in 3 movements. This is what my friend heard. This is what my friend saw. And here's what happened when I went. It takes a lot to make me shiver, and I haven't felt so cold this entire season. The editors of the anthology say there aren't enough weird places in the world. True enough, maybe, but Places We Fear to Tread sets a good precedent. And this is Associate Editor Shauna Borman's review of Grotesque, Monster Stories by Lee Murray. History, mythology, and monsters. If I had to choose 3 words to sum up Lee Murray's collection, Grotesque, Monster Stories, those would be the ones. Every story in this book is infused with a little of each of these things. For instance, Grotesque, Edward's Journal, Lifeblood, and Into the Clouded Sky are all firmly rooted in the histories of their settings. France in the 1500s, the British colonization of New Zealand, the 1898 Kauri Gum Industry Act, and a trip to the Pink and White Terraces in 1886. But the candy coating of mythological terror and unearthly evil makes the real-life horror of them all slightly easier to live with. On the other hand, history and mythology take a back seat to the monsters of stories like Selfie, Dead End Town, and Heart Music. In these stories, it's difficult to separate the monsters from the people. A man-made catastrophe, a pedophile, a necrophiliac. It's nearly impossible for any amount of make-believe monsters to be more unsettling than the humans in these tales, so they take on different roles instead. The human chimera is the victim, the killer plant still isn't as bad as the people, and the ghost just wants someone to keep her company. Other stories like Hawaii and Maui's Hook pull from history and mythology to create complex stories full of gore and heroes who aren't exactly made for the role, like a group of fishermen and a woman who runs her family's boat rental place. There's also a zombie tale, The New Breed, because no monster collection would be complete without one. But I think my favorite out of all of these stories is Cave Fever. It has its own history of people being forced underground by a severe solar storm, the mythology of life on the surface, and the kind of monsters that humans turn into when they live in constant fear. If you're anything like me, this is a collection you'll read for the gore, but will stay with you because of the monsters, mythology, and history.
We rely on you for everything, and somehow, even this year, you've come through. Author and story payments, staff, you name it. We still need your help, as we'd love to be able to pay associate editors, or as you know them, slush wranglers. These are the folks who every story meets, and they are the unsung, vital component of an entire industry. They mean a lot to us. We have the utmost respect for them, and it's time they were paid. And we'd like to be part of that change. To help us, you have two options. Patreon pledges start from as little as $5 a month and go up to levels where you get exclusive merchandise. PayPal subscriptions start at $5 a month. Both get you default access to our vast vault of free audio. And if you can't manage money, perhaps a little time. Write a review, tweet a link, have us on your podcast. It all helps. It's all needed. And thank you. Join us next week when, as now, will be a production of Escape Artists Incorporated and released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial and No Derivatives license. That story is going to be Workday by Kurt Fulver and hosted by the amazing Mother Horror. Audio production will be done once again by the incomparable Marty Perrette, and the reading will be a full cast of PseudoPod All-Stars, including, but not limited to, Karen Bovenmeyer, Scott Campbell, Chelsea Davis, Graham Dunlop, Alex Hoffelick, Kaz, Brian Lieberman, SK Nash, and Kitty Sarkozy. I can't wait. Have an excellent Christmas, folks, and I will leave you with this quote from Tony Judd. The historian's task is not to disrupt for the sake of it, but is to tell what is almost always an uncomfortable story and explain why the discomfort is part of the truth we need to live well and live properly. A well-organized society is one in which we know the truth about ourselves, collectively, not one in which we tell pleasant lies about ourselves. What a perfect note to round this year off on. Goodbye 2020. I will see you all in 2021. Have an excellent festive season and enjoy next week.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.